My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I'm 68 years old today. Not old enough to be invisible, but apparently old enough to be talked over at my own birthday dinner. The dining room sparkled with curated elegance. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier's glow like frozen fireworks. The silverware, real silver, not the kind you'd casually toss into a dishwasher, rested perfectly beside bone-white china. A rose-colored runner sliced through the middle of the long oak table. Everything was precise, cold, unwelcoming. There were 12 people at that table. 13 if you count me. I sat at the head, technically the guest of honor. But if you looked at the way they leaned away from me, how their conversations circled around me like I was a decorative centerpiece rather than a human, you'd think I was already gone. Caleb, my only son, raised his glass. He wore a navy sport coat I didn't recognize. A pinched smile I did. His wife Reagan had planned the dinner. I could tell. Her fingerprints were all over it. Subtle branding, name cards with gold foil, even a birthday menu with my name printed in cursive at the top. A name they rarely used anymore unless they were reminding me to refill a prescription. "Mom," Caleb began, holding his glass with the kind of posture that gets taught in corporate seminars. "We're just so glad you could make it." "Make it?" "I live 15 minutes away, Caleb," I said lightly, not quite ready to reveal the scrape under the humor. He grinned, already moving on. 68. That's something. There was a soft chorus of laughter. The polite kind you offer a stranger who's just told a mildly offensive joke. Then someone, Reagan's sister maybe, brought up a new fitness tracker. And just like that, I disappeared again. They talked around me like I wasn't there. Someone made a joke about memory loss. I didn't laugh. I watched them instead. Reagan pouring wine but not into my glass. Caleb texting under the table. The twins, my grandchildren, scrolling their phones, their thumbs never resting. Even the birthday candles had been replaced by some minimalist glass dome that emitted a soft, ambient light but held no warmth, like everything else in the room. Then it happened. Caleb, without glancing at me, leaned toward Reagan and said in a voice just loud enough, "She'll forget this anyway." And the room kept spinning like nothing had been said. But something had. My fingers curled around the edge of my napkin, folding it in half, then again. I kept my face neutral, a talent I'd honed over the years. I let the words simmer beneath the surface, slow and dangerous. "She'll forget this anyway." I could still hear my husband's voice in the back of my mind. Martin, dead 6 years now from a stroke that came too suddenly to fight. He used to say things like, "Don't let them erase you, Ellie. You've always remembered too much. That's your power." Too much, not enough. I stared down at the plate in front of me. Pan-seared duck, blood orange reduction, stacked vertically on a bed of what I assumed was truffle mashed potato. Not a single thing I liked. I told Reagan last year, no duck, no mushrooms, no overly sweet sauces. But here it was again, not a mistake, a decision. I put my fork down. "You okay, Mom?" Caleb asked, a performance for the table. His voice had that fake concern. Light, airy, one eyebrow lifted just so. "I'm just remembering," I replied softly. "Remembering what?" he chuckled, sipping his wine. "Things you probably hoped I'd forget," I said, locking eyes with him. That silenced the table. For a moment, just a beat. Then someone coughed, someone else raised a glass, and the noise returned. But something inside me stayed silent. I sat through dessert, though I didn't touch it. Chocolate torte, another thing I hadn't asked for. When Reagan brought out the cake, 3 tiers, gold-flecked icing, white flowers, I stared at it like it was a tombstone with my name on it. "Happy birthday, Eleanor!" someone cheered. I nodded. My jaw ached from holding the same smile too long. They wanted photos. I stood in the center while Caleb wrapped an arm around me for show. His cologne smelled like expensive indifference. I smiled for the camera, then stepped away. Later, while they all chatted over coffee, I slipped into the hallway. Their laughter followed me like a bad echo. I stood by the front door, hand resting on the knob. I looked back once. The dining room glowed with laughter, but no one noticed I was leaving. No one looked up, not even Caleb. I closed the door behind me and walked into the cold night, heels tapping softly against the stone driveway. The stars were out, clear and sharp. I inhaled, steady and full, then exhaled like I was making space for something. At home, I went straight to my study. The light flickered when I turned it on, casting long shadows across my bookshelves. A framed photo of Martin stared back at me from the desk, his smile warm, worn by time. I opened the drawer, pulled out a red leather folder, my will, untouched since Martin died. As I turned each page, I thought about the way Caleb had said it, dismissively, carelessly. She'll forget this anyway, but I hadn't. And I wouldn't, not this time. The night air pressed cold against my cheeks as I walked home, alone, my heels clicking like a metronome for memories I hadn't invited. Streetlights flickered above me, blinking in slow intervals, on, off, pause, like Morse code from the sky. Their glow reflected off puddles on the sidewalk, casting long, broken versions of myself. I moved through them like a ghost retracing her final walk. Caleb hadn't offered to drive me home, no one had. But I hadn't asked either. The cold helped. It reminded me I was still here. When I reached my house, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood at the threshold, hand resting on the doorknob, eyes adjusting to the familiar darkness. My home didn't need illumination to feel alive. It pulsed with history, with choices, with echoes. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it. The chair near the fireplace still tilted slightly from where I always sat to read. The woven blanket, Martin's favorite, hung crookedly on the armrest. I ran my fingers over the back of the chair as I passed, trailing a line through years of silence. I entered my study and switched on the lamp. A pool of yellow light bathed the desk and surrounding shelves. The bulb buzzed faintly, like it was whispering to itself. The room smelled like dust and ink. I opened the bottom drawer. Inside were layers of me, folded and filed away. Newspaper clippings from former students who'd gone on to publish books, thank you notes with handwriting I still recognized, and a box filled with old music boxes I'd meant to repair. I opened one. The tinny melody of Claire de Lune played, slow and warped. I let it finish, not out of sentiment but respect. Then came the letters, stacks of them, some bound with string, others loose, their edges yellowed. There were birthday cards Caleb had drawn in crayon, back when love was easier to give. There were folded Mother's Day notes that promised to never grow up and leave you, written by a child who had since become a man I barely knew. There was nothing flashy in those drawers, just remnants of someone who'd once mattered, someone who'd made herself small for the sake of everyone else's space. I sat on the floor and let the music box replay itself. Flashbacks came like a breeze through a cracked window. Me, rocking Caleb to sleep while Martin worked late again. Me, skipping department dinners to attend school plays where Caleb forgot his lines. Me, listening to Martin tell Caleb that real men don't cry, while I stood behind the kitchen door, silently weeping for both of them. Motherhood had been a performance, a sacrifice on repeat, a never-ending chorus of, "It's fine, I don't need thanks." But I did. I just stopped asking, and now they didn't even pretend. I stood and pulled a red leather folder from the file cabinet. My name was embossed on the front in gold, faded but still legible. It was the will Martin and I had drafted together years ago in the quiet panic that follows a health scare. It hadn't been updated since he passed. The ink on his signature had dried the same week the nurse handed me his wedding ring in a Ziploc bag. I ran my fingers over his name, Martin Whitmore. He had been brilliant, distant, wounded in places I could never reach. He raised our son with the kind of sharpness that left marks, and I had stood beside it, hoping Caleb would learn resilience, not repetition. But he hadn't. Eleanor narrates, he taught them to mock softness. I raised them to love with caution. I read over the will. It left everything to Caleb, the house, the retirement accounts, the copyrights to my papers, even the collection of first edition novels I had spent a lifetime building. I set it down and stared at the wall. I could still hear Martin's voice during our last edit. "Don't make this emotional, Ellie. He's our son. He'll do right by you." I believed him. Then. I no longer did. I placed the will back in the drawer, slower this time, like I was laying a body to rest. Then I made tea. I didn't sleep that night. The hours slipped by in paragraphs. I reread old manuscripts, rearranged the photo frames on the mantel. I considered calling Harper, my niece, but it was too late, and too early. When morning came, I finally stepped outside. The sun was soft and unfocused, like it hadn't yet committed to the day. I walked to the mailbox, but before I reached it, I heard voices. Caleb's voice. He and Reagan were walking up the driveway. I froze behind the porch trellis, not yet ready to be seen. They didn't know I was there. Reagan laughed. "So when do we get to list it?" My heart stilled. Caleb replied, his voice low but clear. "Once she's in the memory ward, or when she finally admits she needs help. Either way, we're not waiting forever. That house is worth a fortune." Reagan's response was punctuated with a snort. "God, I hope she forgets where she put her keys again this week. That would speed things up." Then they walked into the house. My house, with a key I'd given them years ago. I stayed hidden, breath caught in my throat like a scream I couldn't release. Not grief, not shock, clarity. I walked down the sidewalk, not into the house, not yet. Instead, I stood at the corner, watching my own windows light up from the inside. They moved through my living room like it belonged to them. Caleb picked up the photo of Martin. Reagan opened the fridge. They were already practicing for my absence. I turned, walked back toward the street, my mind sharper than it had been in weeks. "She'll forget this anyway," Caleb had said. But I remembered. I remembered everything, and that was going to change everything. When I finally stepped back inside, the house welcomed me with its familiar chill. Not cold from weather, but age, from silence, from the way old homes hold breath like secrets. I bolted the door behind me. It was still early morning, and the sunlight hadn't yet breached the eastern windows. Dust hung in the air like pale confetti, illuminated by whatever fragments of daylight spilled in through the lace curtains. The house wasn't just where I lived. It was where I existed. Every room in it was a keepsake, a sealed envelope I'd never dared to open all at once. I walked through it slowly that morning, not to clean or to fix, but to witness. The front room still held the green velvet couch we bought in 1987, even though one leg wobbled and it groaned when sat upon. The mantel displayed the same porcelain swan my mother had once called tacky, but I kept it anyway. Maybe out of spite, maybe out of sentiment. The fireplace hadn't been lit in 2 winters, not since Caleb said I shouldn't be around open flame alone. The hallway bore the grooves of decades, faint scuffs from moving furniture, low marks from where Caleb used to run his toy trucks along the walls. The photos on the wall were arranged in ascending age. Caleb at 3, covered in cake. Caleb at 11, grinning with missing teeth. Caleb at 18, his arm thrown around Martin, both squinting into the sun. There were no recent photos. And then there was the study. I opened the door, and the familiar creak of the hinges greeted me like a sigh. That room had stayed untouched longer than it should have. Not out of neglect, but reverence. The desk sat where it always had, battered, solid oak, and permanently ink-stained in one corner from an overfilled fountain pen in 1994. The stain looked almost elegant now, like a bruise that had settled into the skin. Stacked along the shelves were my volumes: Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, Toni Morrison. Women who wrote as though survival was an act of rebellion. Their spines were faded, some torn at the edges, others pristine, as though waiting for someone bold enough to engage with their truths. I ran a finger across the top shelf. Dust came away on my fingertips like powdered history. My chair was still draped in the same cardigan I used to wear during cold writing nights. Threadbare navy blue, elbows stretched from overuse. It smelled faintly of lavender oil and thyme. I sat, and I let the room swallow me whole. Behind the books, taped to the back wall of the shelf, was a photo of my mother. I didn't display it. I never had. She was seated stiffly, hands clasped in her lap, wearing that same cruel necklace she never took off. Pearls, perfect, uniform, suffocating. Her mouth was drawn into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It never had. My mother was a woman of appearances, cold, perfectionist, polite in public, brutal in private. Her love was conditional, something you earned by pleasing her and lost the moment you deviated. She didn't raise me, she corrected me. When I got the scholarship to teach literature at university, she didn't congratulate me. She said, "Well, at least you'll be around people who read." When I married Martin, she warned, "Don't let yourself go soft. Men get bored." And when Caleb was born, she visited once, just once, and held him like he was made of glass she hadn't asked for. I tried to parent differently. I swore I would. But as I sat there, looking around the room, I could feel her fingerprints, passed down through mannerisms and warnings, through inherited silences and the pressure to perform. Then the realization settled, slow and sharp. Caleb wasn't just Martin's son, he was hers too. The same detachment, the same condescension dressed up as concern, the same cold calculation beneath a polished surface, not because he meant harm, but because warmth was never taught as a language worth learning. I had broken the cycle in intent, but not in outcome. I took a deep breath, held it, and let it out through my teeth. The sound cracked the silence. It wasn't too late. I pulled out a stack of journals from the lower shelf. Some were blank. Others held snippets of writing I'd abandoned over the years. Half poems, old grocery lists, outlines for books I never had time to finish. I found one that still had more than half its pages empty. The cover was soft leather, maroon, and the binding cracked just slightly when opened. I turned to the first clean page. Date: April 9th. Time: 8:17 a.m. The header I wrote was deliberate, for the ones who will never ask. And I began, not to preserve my memory, but to build a legacy. I documented everything: the birthday dinner, Caleb's comment, the plans I overheard. But more than that, I wrote about who I had been before anyone else had opinions about it. I wrote about dancing in the rain at 23 in my wedding dress. I wrote about how I once stayed up 48 hours to finish grading essays, only to cry when one student wrote, "You made me want to live differently." I wrote about how motherhood was both a dream and a mausoleum, how I buried so much of myself to make room for a son who no longer recognized the soil I came from. The words poured out like they had been trapped behind ribs. I wrote until my hand cramped. Then I kept writing. By the time I stopped, 3 hours had passed, and the sun had risen high enough to fill the room with reluctant light. The desk glowed. The bookshelves glowed. Even the ink on the page seemed warmer than it had when I began. I capped the pen. This journal wasn't a diary. It was a witness, a testament, a line in the sand. I was no longer writing for them to remember me. I was writing so they would never be able to rewrite me. I hadn't spoken to Harper in 3 years. Not out of anger, just circumstance. That's how distance forms in families like ours. Not with explosions, but with quiet exits and doorways we never open again. So when she knocked on my door that Wednesday afternoon, sunlight bleeding through the stained glass window above her head, I felt something like oxygen rush into the house. "Hi, Aunt Ellie," she said, a sketchbook clutched against her chest like a shield. Her dark hair was longer now, tied up in a loose knot. She looked tired in a way only artists do, like she'd spent more time in her own head than out of it. I stepped aside to let her in. "You look the same," she said softly. "You look like you stopped trying to please anyone." That's a compliment, by the way. Harper smiled, and just like that, the room softened. We settled in the study. She chose the floor instead of a chair and began sketching absently in her notebook. I didn't ask why she was here. I didn't need to. Some people arrive not with questions, but with timing. The house, which had spent the last few days pressing in on me, suddenly stretched its limbs. Her presence brought air. She didn't fill the silence. She honored it. That's how Harper had always been, even as a child, watching, absorbing, storing things in the invisible gallery behind her eyes. "I was in town," she offered. "I thought I'd just see." "I'm glad you did," I said, and I meant it more than I expected to. We talked little. She walked with me through the house, touching old picture frames, pointing out things she remembered but never said aloud. We stood in the kitchen for a long time, letting the kettle boil twice before pouring the tea. She took hers with honey in silence. I took mine with memory. As the sun began to dip below the trees, painting amber patterns across the hardwood floors, Harper finally said, "You remember everything, Aunt Ellie. That's the curse, isn't it?" I laughed, but it caught in my throat. "It's the inheritance." She looked up from her sketchbook. "From Grandma?" "And hers before her. Women in our family don't scream. They store until we're too full to breathe," Harper added. We sat with that. I thought about my mother again, her cold critiques and tight-lipped lessons, about how she never let me cry without calling it weakness, how she believed in order, not comfort, how she measured worth by presentation. She had taught me silence was survival, and I had carried that forward into everything, into marriage, into motherhood, into grief, until now. Now I was overflowing. "I'm changing my will," I said suddenly. Harper looked up. I leaned back in my chair. "Caleb's been making plans. Plans that don't require me being around. Plans that assume I'll forget. I won't." Harper didn't flinch. "I need someone, quiet, smart, not afraid of family mess." She tilted her head. "A lawyer?" I nodded. "Do you know a good one?" She pulled her sketchbook close and began writing something in the corner. "Actually, yes, my friend Jonah. He does elder law. He's good, honest, and gentle, in the way people usually aren't with women who've already survived everything." That made me smile. "I'd like to meet him," I said. "I'll arrange it." And just like that, the plan stopped being a feeling and became a direction. Harper stayed the night. She slept in the guest room, curled up under the quilt my grandmother had sewn in the 60s. In the morning, she made coffee before I could. She sat at the window sketching the oak tree in the backyard, the one Caleb once carved his initials into when he was 9. When she left, she didn't say goodbye. Just, "I'll text Jonah, and I'll come back soon." I watched her walk down the front steps, hair swinging behind her like a ribbon of defiance. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something new taking root. Not revenge, not bitterness, just clarity. I moved through the day differently. I took down the old will and placed it in a box labeled Replace. I drafted a list of changes, not just names, but values. Things I wanted to preserve, things I refused to pass on. Then I checked my mail. Among the bills and catalogs was a crisp envelope from Horizon National Bank, my name printed in bold. I opened it casually, but the first line knocked the wind out of me. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore, this letter confirms the in-person meeting with your designated power of attorney, Mr. Caleb Whitmore, held on April 7th at our Central Branch office." I stopped reading. Power of attorney? My legs moved before my mind caught up. I crossed the living room, grabbed the legal folder from the study, and flipped through it. There, tucked in the back, was a document I barely remembered signing, something Martin had filed when his health declined. We had listed Caleb, out of practicality, never imagining misuse, never imagining he'd use it to stage a quiet coup. I sat back, paper trembling in my hands. He had gone to the bank. He was moving fast, behind my back, without my consent, without discussion. The rest of the letter detailed a review of assets, a mention of my property value, the trust accounts, a note about the family estate's anticipated restructuring. I read it twice. Each word sliced through me with surgical precision. This wasn't anticipation, it was an operation. He was preparing to excise me before I could protest. I placed the letter on the table, smoothed it flat with my palms, and stared. I wasn't confused. I wasn't forgetful. I wasn't powerless. But if I did nothing, I would be all three in his version of the story. I walked into the study, took out a fresh journal, and wrote in block letters across the first page, Chapter 1. This is not how I go quietly. I started packing quietly. No announcements, no farewells, no explanations. Just cardboard boxes, carefully folded clothes, and the quiet creak of floorboards as I moved through rooms that once felt eternal. The house didn't resist, but it did observe. I began in the hallway. An odd place to start, maybe. But the truth of a home is always in its transitions. I took down the framed photographs lining the walls, row by row. Caleb's milestones captured in silver frames. His first steps, his graduation, the forced family Christmas photo where Martin's hand was firm on my shoulder. And mine disappeared behind a tray of gingerbread cookies I'd baked alone. Behind the frames, the wallpaper told a different story. It peeled away in delicate strips, the glue weakened by years of sunlight and seasonal shifts. Beneath it, the original wall was stained and cracked, marked by age and humidity. The kind of damage no guest ever saw. The kind of damage you lived with so long, it stopped looking like damage. I ran my fingers over the discolored plaster, felt the unevenness beneath my nails. All these years, I'd dressed the house like I dressed myself, for company, for survival, for appearances. But beneath it was wear, history, hurt. I placed the photos face down on the table. In the bedroom, I began with the closet. Martin's suits were long gone, donated after the funeral, but a few of his things remained. His cufflinks in a velvet box, a pair of loafers with soles too worn to give away. I kept them not out of love, but out of unfinished sentences. Next to his old winter coat, I found something else. Tucked in the pocket of a cardigan I hadn't worn since 2018. A folded index card in my own handwriting. Don't believe everything he says. You are not difficult. You are not forgetful. You are not too much. A therapy note. One of the mantras my last counselor had encouraged me to write and keep close. A small lifeline scribbled in ink, long dismissed as melodrama once I returned home from each session and fell back into the rhythm of silence. I unfolded it again and read it aloud. My voice cracked somewhere in the middle. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and let the flood come. I thought of Caleb, 5 years old, watching Martin berate me for burning the roast. Can't you follow simple instructions, Ellie? It's not rocket science, it's a timer. I'd apologized. I always did. But I'd looked over at Caleb that night and saw something I hadn't been prepared for. Amusement, the curl of a smirk. He'd only been 5. Later, when he was 10, he threw a tantrum over a denied video game. I had tried to talk to him, calmly, rationally, and he had mimicked Martin's voice. Maybe if you were smarter, Mom. It wasn't the words that crushed me. It was the ease with which they came, like second language, like instinct. That was the night I stayed up until morning, Googling child therapists, then deleting the tabs. Another flash. Caleb at 15, standing in the hallway, defending his father during one of our colder fights. You make everything dramatic. Dad just tells the truth. Maybe you should stop being so emotional all the time. I'd said nothing. What could I say? I had already taught him that his father's voice held more authority than mine. I had reinforced it by surviving it silently. I thought I was shielding him from chaos, but all I'd done was model quietness as virtue, endurance as love, and suppression as maternal duty. Now, he wielded that lesson like a scalpel. I reached for the suitcase and packed with mechanical precision. Books first, then blouses I still liked the feel of, then the journals. Always the journals. As I packed, I found scraps everywhere, pieces of the woman I'd buried under the responsibility of being someone else's reflection. A dried lavender sachet from my first trip to Maine alone. A pair of earrings Harper made me when she was 13. Silver twists, imperfect but sincere. A concert ticket stub from a night I went dancing in secret while Martin was away at a conference. I had never told anyone. I danced barefoot. Each item felt like a breadcrumb back to myself. In the study, I paused at the bookshelves, debating what to bring and what to leave. I selected the volumes that had stayed with me the longest: Plath's Ariel, Woolf's The Waves, and Adrian Rich's Diving into the Wreck. I opened Rich's book, and inside was a note from a student. You changed how I see women, how I see my mother. Thank you. I placed it in the journal pile. By evening, 3 boxes were taped and labeled. 2 more stood half full. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, now partially bare, and stared at the patch of wall where the sun always landed at 4:30 p.m. It was glowing, quiet, familiar, and it made me ache. Not for the house, but for the years I had wasted inside it, waiting for someone to see me when I could have lit the match myself. My internal voice surfaced again, sharper now. Maybe I stayed too long hoping they'd heal, but they learned to hurt. The room didn't argue. I turned out the light and shut the door. Not gently, but finally. The office smelled like lemon polish and silence. Not the cold kind of silence, the sterile humming sort that fills legal offices, but a stillness that felt almost respectful, as if the walls knew what I had come to do. Jonah was younger than I expected. Late 30s, maybe. His desk was cluttered with neatly stacked files, a half-drunk mug of coffee, and a framed photo of his partner and 2 golden retrievers. It disarmed me more than I thought it would. He stood when I entered. Miss Whitmore? Eleanor, I said. No need to give me a title I've never asked for. He smiled gently and gestured to the chair. Harper said you'd be formidable. She gives me too much credit, I replied, taking a seat. Or not enough. We got straight to it. I handed him the old will, and he flipped through it quickly, scanning its familiar structure. Everything to Caleb. No contingencies, no questions. A carbon copy of the one Martin had drawn up decades ago. Jonah looked up. And you're looking to make significant changes? I'm looking to undo a lifetime of assumption, I said, and I want it done properly. He nodded. I can draft a full replacement. Do you already know who you'd like to name as beneficiaries? I reached into my bag and pulled out the notebook. I'd written it all out in red ink. Not because it was urgent, though it was, but because red felt honest, unapologetic. "I want Harper to have the house," I began. "She's the only one who sees it for what it is, walls and wounds and truth." He made a note. "And the rest, my retirement fund, my savings, goes to a women's shelter I used to volunteer with. Quietly, no photos, no fundraisers, just laundry and soup and stories I was trusted with." Jonah didn't blink. "That can be arranged." We went through every detail. Power of attorney revoked, medical directives rewritten, emergency contacts updated. Jonah walked me through the language like a guide through a war zone. Calm, direct, compassionate. Then he asked, gently, "Would you like to include a note, a statement of intent?" I considered it. And then I said the words I didn't know I had been carrying. "I'm not dying. I'm just remembering who I am." He typed it without hesitation. We reviewed everything twice. I initialed every page, signed the final one with the steadiness of a woman who'd once been mistaken for fragile. When it was over, Jonah looked at me and said, "You're not the first to walk in here with history in their hands. But most people don't have the courage to rewrite it." I stood. "Then they've forgotten they hold the pen." I left with copies in my purse and a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Back home, I set the old will on the fireplace mantel. It sat there for an hour while I gathered kindling, while I washed the teacups Harper had left behind, while I stared at a photo of Caleb at age 7, wearing a superhero cape he refused to take off for a week. Then, without ceremony, I lit the fire. The paper curled inward, blackening at the corners, ink twisting like smoke signals before turning to ash. The room filled with the scent of something finished. I didn't cry. Not out of bitterness, but relief. Later that night, I sat at my writing desk and pulled out a fresh stack of envelopes. Heavy, cream-colored, from the stationery set Martin once gave me for our 25th anniversary. I hadn't used them, until now. I wrote 8 letters. To an old friend I'd stopped calling after Martin complained she was too loud. To my first student to publish a novel whom I'd lost contact with after she moved to Oregon. To the librarian at the university who had once stayed late with me cataloging damaged poetry volumes, quietly reminding me that books were meant to be touched, and so were people. To the shelter director who never asked for more than I could give. To the woman at the diner who always remembered my order, even when I stopped remembering hers. To my sister, who'd stayed silent through too much, but never unkind. To Harper, and to myself. That last letter was brief. "Dear Eleanor, you were not a mistake. You were simply misplaced. Welcome back." Me. I sealed each envelope, addressed them by hand, and placed stamps in the upper right corners with deliberate pressure. Each letter felt like closing a chapter, not in regret, but in ownership. Then I walked to the mailbox under a moonless sky and sent them out into the world. I slept well that night, until the doorbell rang the next morning. It was a courier, suited, expressionless, holding a thick manila envelope. "Eleanor Whitmore?" he asked. I nodded. "Legal delivery, signature required." I took the pen, signed, closed the door. I opened the envelope on the kitchen counter. Inside was a document titled Petition for Guardianship, filed by Caleb Whitmore. It detailed erratic behavior, diminished cognitive function, questionable legal decisions, and the need for immediate intervention to preserve family assets. My heart beat loud in my ears, but my hands were steady. On the final page, Caleb's signature curved confidently above the line labeled Petitioner. I stared at it, unmoved. He wasn't afraid of my death. He was afraid of my clarity, and that meant he understood. I folded the petition and placed it next to the copy of my new will. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee and began writing again. The courtroom smelled like disinfectant and wood polish, cold and impersonal, like a place where lives were dissected rather than protected. The overhead fluorescents buzzed softly, their sterile light settling over the gallery like judgment. I sat at the petitioner's table, not as a criminal, but as someone forced to defend the right to live with clarity. The bailiff called the room to order. Across from me sat Caleb, in a navy suit too crisp for the truth he was about to twist. His tie was the same deep red Martin used to wear to academic conferences. Reagan sat behind him, her lips pursed into a line that had no place for apology. A carefully curated team of legal support flanked him. Two associates, one lead attorney with an easy smirk. My lawyer, Jonah, leaned toward me and whispered, "Stay still, stay sharp." I nodded. My fingers tightened slightly around the object in my lap. Martin's old fountain pen. Polished, heavy, still filled with blue ink. A reminder that some signatures hold weight even in absence. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and a cautious gaze, looked over the petition. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, "you've brought this case forward, claiming your mother is mentally incompetent. Please proceed." Caleb stood and adjusted his jacket like he was stepping onto a stage. "Your Honor, I've always had my mother's best interests at heart. But lately, she's been erratic. She's made sudden, drastic changes to her legal documents. She refuses assistance. She's isolating herself. And she's displaying signs of memory decline." He turned to the table, pulled out a folder, and began his performance. "This is a transcript of a voicemail she left me last month, where she forgets the name of her pharmacy. This," he flipped to another page, "is a record of her missing a utilities payment in February. And this is a sworn statement from our neighbor, Mrs. Jeffers, who says Eleanor seemed confused when they spoke last week." Each piece was a thread, isolated and stretched thin, designed to resemble a pattern that didn't exist. I sat still, watching him. "Your Honor," Caleb continued, "I'm not doing this lightly, but I can't stand by while she jeopardizes her future and ours. She's vulnerable and someone—" His voice dropped slightly, feigning concern. "Someone might be manipulating her." Harper's eyes narrowed from the gallery. Jonah stood. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we will demonstrate that these examples are misleading, cherry-picked moments taken entirely out of context, and that Mrs. Whitmore remains fully capable of making informed, legal, and personal decisions." The judge nodded once. "Very well, let's proceed." Jonah called me to the stand. I walked slowly, not because I was frail, but because every step meant something. I sat, adjusted the microphone, and rested the pen gently on the table in front of me, its barrel cool against my palm. Jonah began simply. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you describe what happened on the evening of April 8th? "The night Caleb said, 'She'll forget this anyway.' At my birthday dinner?" I asked calmly. "Yes. I went home and found the will I'd signed years ago with my husband. I read it. I remembered every clause, every line. Then I remembered what I had forgotten for too long. Myself." Jonah nodded. "And since then? I've documented every step. I've kept journals, dated entries. I made deliberate decisions regarding my estate. I am not confused. I am not diminished. I am finally awake." He gestured to the judge. "Would you be willing to recall specific details under oath?" "I would." "Where did you file your updated will?" "Jonah Bennett's office, 14th Street, second floor. Signed at 10:32 a.m. on April 12th. Witnessed by his assistant, Dana Torres." "What's the title of the first book on the second shelf in your study?" I smiled faintly. "The Bell Jar," by Sylvia Plath, marked on page 137. A pressed violet rests inside. The judge's expression shifted subtly, curiosity replacing detachment. Caleb's attorney stood. "Mrs. Whitmore, have you ever forgotten your pharmacy's name?" "Once," I replied, "because I'd changed providers and the new one was still in the system as pending." I called back 5 minutes later. "I also recall your client forgot his own zip code while renewing his driver's license last year. But I don't assume that makes him unfit." A murmur of restrained laughter rustled the gallery. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Harper was called next. She walked to the stand like someone carrying generations behind her. Jonah spoke. "Can you describe your aunt's recent behavior?" "She's the most lucid person I know," Harper said, her voice steady and unwavering. "She reads more than anyone I've met. She writes daily. She remembers things I barely recall living through. She's precise and deliberate. If anything, she's clearer now than I've ever seen her." "Do you believe she's being manipulated?" Harper looked directly at Caleb. "Number she's finally free of it." Caleb's attorney tried to discredit her, called her estranged, emotionally biased. But Harper didn't waver. "She wasn't estranged," I said from the stand unprompted. "She was preserving herself, something I wish I'd done sooner." The judge allowed it to stand. Testimony concluded. Documents submitted. The judge recessed for 20 minutes. I sat back at the table, gripping the pen like an anchor. It had once been Martin's, a tool he used to sign papers, grade student work, and write the will that nearly erased me. Now it was mine. When the judge returned, she looked over the rim of her glasses, then down at her notes. This court does not find sufficient evidence to support the claim of mental incompetence. Guardianship is denied. Mrs. Whitmore retains full legal autonomy. A pause. I also strongly caution the petitioner against misusing legal channels for personal inheritance disputes. This court does not exist to enforce entitlement. Her gavel struck. The courtroom emptied slowly, like air releasing from a pressure chamber. Caleb didn't look at me. Reagan pulled him away by the sleeve. Outside, under a sharp spring sky, Harper and I stood silently. She touched my arm. Was that hard? Yes, I said, but I've done harder things, like staying quiet for 50 years. We walked toward the parking lot, steps synchronized like echoes of a path we now walked forward, together. The courthouse steps stretched wide beneath the late afternoon sun. I stood at the edge of them, watching Caleb descend slowly, as if the ruling had stolen something heavier than inheritance. He didn't see me at first. He was too busy buttoning his coat, whispering something to Reagan, who stared straight ahead like she was already elsewhere. When he did notice me, he flinched. A flicker of recognition, not of guilt, but of being seen in a light he couldn't control. I didn't wait for a greeting. You wanted my mind to rot, I said, so you wouldn't have to remember what you became. He blinked, took a breath, reached for his jacket lapel like it could defend him. That's not fair, Mom. I was trying to help. Stop, I cut in. You weren't helping. You were hoping. Hoping I'd forget the things you still can't face. His face shifted, lips pressed tight, jaw clenched. Still no apology. I didn't want it to come to this, he said finally. But you've been unpredictable. No, I corrected. I've been inconvenient. There's a difference. He looked away. You changed your will, he said, like it was a confession he had to squeeze out. Yes. You gave the house to Harper, to a stranger. She's not a stranger, I replied. She's just someone I didn't ruin by loving the wrong way. He flinched at that, but again, he didn't apologize. He deflected. You're just bitter, he said. You've always been a martyr, Mom. Everything's a sacrifice with you. I almost laughed. A martyr? No. A mother who gave too much and asked for too little until the silence began to feel like safety. He looked at me one last time before stepping away. We'll talk, he said. No, I replied. We won't. He paused, the weight of my finality landing, then walked toward the parking lot, alone. Reagan stood by the car, arms folded. Her eyes were sharp, like someone calculating the cost of a decision. Neither of them looked back. That night, the house held its breath. I moved through each room slowly, deliberately, like I was cataloging a life. The echoes of court still hummed behind my ribs, but they were fading now, making space for something quieter, stronger. On the dining room table sat the court papers, stapled and folded, still warm from my hands. Next to them, an unopened birthday card Caleb had mailed 3 years ago. I'd kept it, unopened, out of habit, out of hope. I opened it now, printed words, not handwritten. Happy birthday, Mom. No message, no love, just ink on a page meant to check a box. Beside it, I placed an empty birdcage. It had once held a finch I adored. When it died, I cleaned the cage but never used it again. It stayed on the shelf all these years, not as decor, but as metaphor, a symbol of what I once nurtured, what I once lost, and what I never dared replace. I stood at the window, watching the oak tree sway under a growing wind, and the montage played behind my eyes. Me, 29, skipping a chance to publish my poetry in a regional journal because Caleb had the flu, and Martin said, "You don't really think they're going to pick yours anyway, do you?" Me, 37, turning down a speaking invitation in Chicago because Martin hated travel and Caleb needed a parent at home. Me, 46, erasing every trace of my late father's letters after Martin called them dangerously sentimental. Me, 58, finding out Martin had rewritten part of our will without telling me and choosing not to challenge it. Me, 65, watching Caleb tell a friend at dinner, "She doesn't really get it anymore," while I poured him another glass of wine. A lifetime of edits, of striking through myself in red. but I was done editing now. 2 days later, Harper came over carrying pastries in a paper bag and a letter in her back pocket. She handed it to me without a word. "From Reagan," she said quietly. I unfolded it. The handwriting was tight, controlled, familiar in its restraint. "Eleanor, I'm leaving him. I know that probably doesn't mean anything to you, but I need you to know why. I found a journal I started when we first got married. It was supposed to help me be a better wife. In it, I'd written things like, don't challenge him when he talks over you. Apologize faster. Keep the house quiet. He hates chaos." Reading it now, I realize I was rehearsing how to disappear. You once said I reminded you of yourself. I didn't know whether to be insulted or honored. Now I understand. I was becoming you. And not the you who just won in court. The one who endured. The one who wilted while smiling. I don't want that life. Not anymore. You've given me permission to want something else. Thank you. I folded the letter slowly. "Do you think she means it?" I asked. Harper nodded. "I think she's waking up." We stood in the kitchen, the afternoon light cutting golden lines across the floor. Outside, the wind had picked up, shaking the trees like they'd been holding secrets too long. "Funny," I said. "He thought I was the one losing my grip." Harper looked at me, her eyes soft. "You were holding everything." I reached for her hand. "Not anymore." And for once, that didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. The guest room had always been neutral. Beige walls, a twin bed, a dusty dresser with knobs that clicked too loudly. It had served its purpose over the years, temporary space for visitors who never stayed long enough to leave anything behind. Until Harper. She came with a small suitcase and no expectations, just an open mind and a quiet agreement between us. This time, we were going to do things differently. The first thing we did was paint the walls, pale green, like moss after a spring rain. Harper chose it because it reminded her of recovery, of softness. We opened the curtains wide, letting sunlight flood the room until the shadows retreated like scolded children. I added a lamp with a golden glow, and Harper hung a row of watercolor postcards above the bed, each one hand-painted, each one a different version of home. The room changed, and so did we. We drank tea every evening in the living room. Harper curled on the couch with her sketchbook, me in my reading chair. Sometimes we talked about the past, but more often we didn't. Instead, we spoke about the future like it was a guest worth preparing for. She moved in part-time at first, weekends, then Thursdays, then full weeks when her art commission slowed down. The house stopped creaking as much. It wasn't haunted anymore. One morning, while cleaning out the attic, I found a box of my old teaching materials. Syllabi, lecture notes, prompts I used to give students when they said they had nothing to say. I spread the papers across the dining room table and stared at them like relics. Harper walked in, paused, and smiled. "You're doing it again," she said. "What?" "Remembering who you are." The next day, I called the local community center. They gave me Tuesday nights, small creative writing workshops for women 50 and older. No experience required, just a notebook and a pen. The first night, 5 women showed up, one in grief, one in anger, one in near silence, one laughing too loudly, one trying not to cry. All of them carrying more stories than they knew how to say out loud. We sat in a circle, no desks, no hierarchy. I brought old prompts and asked one question to begin. "What's the thing you weren't supposed to say?" The room stayed quiet for a long time. Then the floodgates opened. It wasn't poetry at first. It wasn't prose. It was truth. Broken and beautiful and clumsy. Like learning how to walk again after forgetting your legs had strength. They told stories of rage disguised as duty, of marriages that became cages, of children who no longer called, of mothers who taught silence like it was survival, of friendships lost to caregiving, of journals burned and dreams buried under mortgages and mended hems. By the 3rd week, we added 2 more chairs. By the 5th, we needed a larger room. Each session felt like peeling wallpaper. Old layers came down, new patterns emerged beneath, not decorative, authentic. One night, after a woman named Clarissa read aloud a letter she wrote to her 16-year-old self, titled, "Forgive me for forgetting you," someone asked, "Why did we wait so long?" Another answered, "Because they told us we were forgetful." I added quietly, "We weren't forgetful, we were just full." That line stayed with us. Someone stitched it onto a pillow, someone else printed it on bookmarks. Clarissa wrote it on her bathroom mirror with lipstick. It became our shared anthem. I brought Harper once. She sat in the back, sketching the women as they read, never drawing faces, only their hands, their posture, their emotional architecture. Afterwards, she said, "You gave them a room, not just a place, a room inside themselves." I smiled. They gave it back to me. Word spread slowly, then quickly. One woman brought her sister, another brought a neighbor. Someone printed a flyer and put it in the window of the library. Soon I was getting emails from women I didn't know, women who wanted space, women who had stories, women who were finally tired of waiting to be asked. I never called myself a teacher anymore. I called myself a door. The house changed with me. The kitchen stayed warm longer into the night. The living room filled with voices, books, and the scent of ink and chamomile. Harper started leaving her sketchbooks on the coffee table. I began writing in mine again. One afternoon, I walked past the guest room, Harper's room, and stopped in the doorway. It wasn't neutral anymore. There was a scarf tossed on the chair, a pair of mismatched slippers under the bed, and a mug with dried paintbrushes resting beside the window. It looked lived in, loved in. Harper called from the hallway. "What are you smiling at?" "Nothing," I said. "Everything." She joined me, leaned against the doorframe. "You ever think," she asked, "maybe the house didn't feel like home because no one ever let it hold them?" I nodded. It was built for a family, but it's finally holding one. We stood there a moment longer. Two women, two generations, two survivors of silence. And in that room, once empty, we found a place to begin again. I hadn't truly looked at myself in months, not the casual glance you give while brushing your hair or checking for toothpaste on your shirt, but the kind of look that pauses time, that asks questions without mercy. It happened one morning, unplanned. The mirror in the hallway had been covered for weeks, draped in an old quilt I once thought I might mend. But that morning, I pulled the quilt down without thinking. And there she was, me. Same wrinkles, deeper now, like etchings in soft stone. Same silver hair, unstyled, curling slightly at the temples. But the eyes, they weren't the same. They weren't waiting anymore. They were watching. For so long, I thought the mirror had betrayed me, aging me, reflecting my invisibility. But now it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like documentation, proof of survival, a living archive of all I had endured and all I had begun to reclaim. I leaned in, studying the woman I used to look past. "I see you," I whispered. And I did. Later that day, while organizing Harper's sewing supplies, an effort to make space for the living, I found the old box. Wooden, weathered, mine, not hers. It had belonged to my mother. The lock clicked open with a snap of defiance, and inside, beneath tangled thread and antique buttons, I found a folded envelope addressed to me. My name in her handwriting. That sharp, angular cursive I used to study on grocery lists and report card signatures. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Or too late to say what I should have years ago. You were never the daughter I expected. But that was my failure, not yours. You challenged things I didn't understand, asked questions I never dared ask myself. You scared me. I wish I had told you that while I was still capable of saying it out loud. I was cruel to you. I thought it would make you strong. I see now that strength without softness is just fear with sharper teeth. Forgive me if you can. If not, at least don't carry me like a wound. Love." Mother, I didn't cry. I waited for the ache, the tremble, the sudden unraveling, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange, steady calm. I closed the letter and walked to the fireplace. The same one where I had burned my old will. The same one where so many things had gone to ash, but never truly disappeared. I struck a match and fed the letter to the flames. Not out of anger, not out of closure, but because I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need her guilt to validate my grief. I didn't need her apology to untie what she knotted inside me. I let the smoke carry it upward and away. I sat down at the desk with a fresh notebook, but this time, instead of writing for myself, I opened my laptop, created a new blog, "Memory is a Weapon." The title came without hesitation. like it had been living inside me all along. I wrote my first post with steady fingers. They said I was losing my mind. I was only losing their version of me. This is for the women who remember everything and were told that makes them dangerous. This is for the mothers who got erased, the daughters who got dismissed, the wives who were folded in half to make room for someone else's ego. This is what I remember. And memory, when wielded, can cut cleaner than any lie ever spoken about us. I published it with one click. Harper found me that evening, sitting in the kitchen, tea growing cold beside me. "You started it," she said. I nodded. "You finally gave the memory a name." We smiled at each other, wordless in the way only women who've excavated their silence can be. 2 weeks later, I noticed the shift. Emails. First a few, then a surge. Women writing from Kansas, Vermont, Texas. Women from retirement homes, from tiny apartments, from family estates they no longer wanted to pass down. Women who said the stories made them feel like someone had cracked open their own silence. I didn't know why it was spreading, until Harper told me. She had taken excerpts from my journals. With my words, never altered, never diluted, she'd anonymously submitted them to an online magazine. They published it under the title, "The Woman Who Refused to Be Forgotten." It went viral, not overnight, but like a storm that starts as a wind, then gathers clouds, then bursts across a landscape in need of rain. I wasn't angry. I was stunned. "I should have asked," Harper said, eyes brimming with guilt. "You didn't need to," I replied. "You heard me before I knew I was speaking." Messages flooded in. One read, "I'm 62. I left my marriage yesterday after reading your words." Another, "I didn't even know I was sad until I read what you survived." One simply said, "You reminded me I still exist." I printed them all and placed them in a shoebox beneath my bed, not for safekeeping but for proof. The blog gained subscribers, readers, fellow writers. It wasn't just a platform now, it was a lifeline. And I, once erased, was now echoing through the lives of women I would never meet, but who felt like old friends rediscovered. That night, I stood once again in front of the mirror, same wrinkles, same hair. But this time, the eyes didn't just watch, they glowed. The letters started as a trickle. Handwritten, typed, sometimes folded inside old envelopes marked with smudged return addresses. They came from towns I'd never visited, cities I'd never lived in. From women whose names I didn't recognize, but whose stories read like entries in my own lost journals. Some began formally, "Dear Ms. Whitmore, I don't usually write to strangers, but I saw your story, and I couldn't sleep until I told you." Others were unfiltered. "I'm 59. I packed my bags after reading your blog and left a house I never called home. My daughter thinks I'm brave now. I never thought she would look at me that way. Because of you, I left." That last one was written in slanted handwriting. Ink blotched in one corner, as if the writer had hesitated mid-sentence and then decided not to start over. No name, no address. Just those 5 words on a postcard with a picture of a cracked window. I pinned it to the corkboard in my study, not because I needed proof, because I wanted to remember what a ripple looks like. These women didn't want money, they didn't ask for advice. They wrote for one reason, to tell me I hadn't lived in vain. That surviving long enough to remember out loud had made a difference. My legacy had already begun, quietly, without paperwork or formal declarations. Not through dollars, through permission, through voice, through memory. I made tea every afternoon and read their words aloud to Harper. Some days we cried, others we laughed at the strange universality of it all, how pain wore so many different names but spoke in the same voice. One letter came from a woman in New Mexico who signed off, "Your courage turned my silence into kindling." I read that line twice. Outside, spring had finally decided to stay. The air smelled of lilacs and damp soil. Harper and I had been working in the backyard for days, clearing the garden, pulling weeds, making room for something new. That morning, we planted a tree, not for anyone in particular, just because it felt like the right thing to do. It was a red maple, small, still learning how to hold itself upright. Harper dug the hole while I poured in the compost, both of us kneeling, dirt under our nails, sweat on our brows. We didn't speak during the planting. The wind did that for us, rustling the branches like a hymn with no words. When it was done, we stood back and admired it in silence. "Think it'll take?" Harper asked. "I hope it doesn't just survive," I said. "I hope it thrives." That afternoon, I sat by the window and journaled the way I used to before all the noise, before courtrooms, lawyers, old ghosts, in newer suits. I wrote, "They say you can't take it with you, but you can leave it behind. A truth, a story, a tree, a trail." That's when the doorbell rang. I opened it slowly. Caleb stood there, alone. He looked thinner. His shoulders slouched slightly, like someone trying to fold himself into an apology. But there was no card in his hand, no flowers, just him. "Hi," he said, voice careful. I nodded. "You came." "I've been reading," he said. "About you." "Not about me," I corrected. "From me," he nodded. "I didn't know," he said. "I mean, maybe I did, but I didn't understand." I crossed my arms. "Now you do?" He hesitated. "I'm trying to." A pause. "I saw the tree in the yard," he added awkwardly. I let the silence hang a moment longer before stepping aside. "Come in, but only for tea." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd signed away too many things over the years. This time, it held only 2 cups of tea and decades of unspoken things. Caleb tried to fill the space with stories from his childhood, the kind that sounded borrowed, safe memories, scrubbed clean of weight. He brought up Harper, said he was glad she was staying here, said he wanted to know her better. Then he asked about the will. I said nothing. Instead, I picked up one of the letters from the pile and handed it to him. He read it quietly. When he finished, he placed it back on the table like it might shatter. "Are they all like this?" I nodded. He stared at his tea. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. I want to fix it," he said, almost whispering. "You can't," I replied gently. He looked up. "Then what do I do?" "Live better, raise better, break what needs breaking." Another pause. "Do you forgive me?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'm not holding it the same way anymore." We finished our tea in silence. When he stood to leave, he opened his mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but I held up my hand. "Not now," I said. "This isn't your chapter." He nodded, more a man now in that surrender than in any of his defiance. As he stepped outside, he glanced once more at the maple tree. "Looks strong," he said. "It will be," I answered, "once its roots catch." And then I closed the door, not out of anger, but because I had somewhere else to be. Back at the desk, back to the keyboard, back to the hundreds of unread. There was no cake this year, no candles, no songs sung out of tune, no clinking glasses or forced smiles around a dinner table. Just a morning sun, soft and golden, cutting across the floor of my bedroom like an invitation. I turned 69. Harper greeted me with tea and silence. The good kind. The kind that settles between people who no longer need to fill the air just to feel present. We walked through the garden barefoot, the grass still wet with dew. The red maple we planted stood taller now, its branches stretching out like it was finally ready to claim space. A few of its leaves had already begun to redden, even though spring was still holding on. "Happy birthday," Harper said softly. "Feels like one," I replied. We passed the patch of rosemary I'd replanted last month, then the daisies Harper had added near the fence. The air smelled of earth and lavender. The birds seemed louder than usual, as if they, too, had something to celebrate. I didn't need balloons. I had this: breath and soil and space. We sat on the garden bench, newly sanded and repainted, and watched the wind bend the trees gently. "It's quiet," I said. "It's yours," Harper replied. That afternoon, I finalized the deed. The house, this house that had once echoed with silence, then survival, then healing, would go to the women's shelter when I passed. The paperwork was already with Jonah. All I had to do was sign the final copy, which I did with the same fountain pen I had carried to court, to the lawyer's office, to every pivotal moment since I began remembering on purpose. It felt less like giving something away, and more like planting something that would keep growing. The blog had taken on a life of its own. Memory as a Weapon now had over 40,000 subscribers. Harper had helped me organize the submissions, women sending in their stories, their artwork, their journals, their rediscovered voices. We published one story each week, selected not by popularity, but by resonance, by truth, by how deeply it pierced and how widely it could echo. Women wrote about leaving marriages at 70, learning to say no without explanation, or simply sitting alone in a cafe and not feeling apologetic for taking up space. One post ended with the line, "They didn't silence me, I was just catching my breath." I printed that one too, taped it above my desk. The desk hadn't changed, still ink-stained, still flanked by shelves lined with Wolf, Plath, Rich, but now there were additions, volumes by the women I'd helped lift, first-time writers, old souls who had only just begun. Every Friday I wrote a new entry, not just for them, but for me. One was titled, "How to Inherit Yourself." Another, "The Grief of Being Overlooked and the Grace of Being Seen." The most shared one? The last time I said, "It's fine." Sometimes I worried I would run out of things to say. Then I'd open a letter, or read a comment, or look out the window at Harper sketching in the sun, and the words would arrive again, fresh and unyielding. That evening, Harper made lentil stew. We ate it on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars blink into view. "I don't know if I've done enough," I admitted. "You've done what matters," she said. The wind rustled the maple. I imagined its roots deepening overnight. Later, I walked the house one last time before sleep. My ritual, the hallway, still lined with photos, now with new ones. Harper laughing in the garden. A group photo from the writing workshop. A woman from the shelter holding her newborn, beaming. In the living room, the bookshelf had expanded. My original collection now shared space with stories from women across the country. I didn't alphabetize them. I arranged them by feeling. In the study, the desk light was still on. I sat and opened the journal. A fresh page stared back at me, unlined and ready. The room was silent. Then, in a final voiceover, the words arrived, not in a whisper, but in the clear tone of a woman who no longer feared her own reflection. They wanted me to forget, but I remembered everything, and I remembered who I was. Outside, dawn began to edge across the sky. I picked up my pen and wrote one final line at the top of the blank page. Memory isn't a curse, it's a compass. And then I closed the book. The sun rose gently behind me, and the house, still and full, welcomed the light. If you've ever been underestimated, rewritten, or made to feel like you'd fade quietly, this story was written with your name between the lines. Not every inheritance is made of money. Some of us pass down memory, fire, and the will to begin again. If that moves something in you, then you already know. This isn't the end, it's the blueprint.